When Australians think about the First World War, they immediately think about Gallipoli and the landing on Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915. That was the first major action fought by the Australian troops during the First World War. We commemorate Anzac Day every year. Around the country, we're commemorating the landing at Anzac that commentators at the time considered Australia's so-called baptism of fire. But in the context of the First World War, it's the Western Front in France and Belgium where Australians make their greatest and most significant contribution to the First World War, and their greatest sacrifices as well. Of the 420,000 Australians who see active service during the First World War, 295,000 fight in France and Belgium. The 60,000 Australians who died during the First World War, 45,000 of them are lost in France and Belgium. So in terms of Australia's contribution, in terms of our losses, they're certainly staggering and certainly unprecedented in Australian military history. But also it's worth keeping in mind too that on the Western Front in France and Belgium is where the Australian Imperial Force played a very prominent role in the defeat of Imperial Germany and brought about the end to what is arguably one of the most violent and catastrophic conflicts in international history. We take communication today for granted. Every day we sit behind a computer, we fire off emails, we get on Facebook, Twitter, we have social media accounts. We're instantaneously connected with the rest of the world. We are light years ahead where we were at the outset of the First World War. In 1914, Australians had very little conception of what participating in this conflict would be like. And it's not until around May 1915 that Australians on the home front start learning of the consequences of participating in the Gallipoli campaign. The news from the landing and the losses that the Australians had suffered were notified first by telegram to the next of kin. And it was a very bland telegram. The Defence Department wishes to inform you that your son, Private John Smith of the 8th Battalion, has been listed as being killed. The casualty lists were published in Australian newspapers as well. And so therefore the Australians had a very public grief. You knew that Mrs. Smith down the road had lost her 2 sons to the fighting in the Dardanelles. I think the greatest tragedy of the First World War is the very nature of the violence and the intensity of trench warfare is that many of the dead were simply missing. These families at home in Australia had no idea or no comprehension about what had happened to their missing son, brother and husband. The Australian war correspondent was Charles Bean, who landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli in April 1915 and remained with them throughout the course of the fighting and up until 1918. Bean was such an assiduous reporter, he made himself a nuisance to the men. The men knew exactly who he was. He saw the war up close and personal and reported on it firsthand. But Bean would also write home dispatches, which of course had to pass censorship regulations as well. That news is funneling gradually home to Australia, and it wasn't immediate. I mean, there was a significant delay of several weeks. When the Australian Imperial Force leaves Australia in late 1914, they do so under the premise that they're going to be joining the British forces for the fighting on the Western Front. When the AIF sails for England, it gets waylaid. The shortest way to get to the training camps in England is through the Suez Canal. And just before the Australian troop ships proceed through the Suez Canal, Ottoman Turkey has entered the war and sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary. And so that puts the Ottoman Empire as a vast empire that it also threatens British interests in the Middle East, including the Suez Canal. So the Australian and New Zealand troops are put off in Egypt, and they spend a great deal of time there. And they ultimately get drawn into a campaign that's designed to knock Ottoman Turkey out of the war. So, no sooner had the Australians began their First World War, they've been sidetracked by a different front completely to the one that they were expecting. Gallipoli is the focus of these operations. The effort there is to try and force a passage through the Dardanelles and shell Constantinople, or Istanbul as it's known today, and hopefully that would be a significant show of force, and it would persuade the Ottomans to withdraw from the war. The Dardanelles are heavily fortified, and that initial naval assault is a costly and unsuccessful failure. The Australian troops form part of a much broader British and French campaign to land ground troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula. When Australians think of Gallipoli, we generally tend to think of the fighting at Anzac, but there were just as many British troops fighting to the south at Cape Helles, the French at Kumkale, and later on during the campaign is the British at Suvla as well.